Hello, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to those all over the world joining us today. Welcome to our final session, Action Towards Collective and Collaborative Change of ICVA's second virtual annual conference on climate, environment, and humanitarian action. How can NGOs mitigate and adapt? I'm ICVA's Learning and Program Coordinator and the Climate and Environment Focal Point. Now, over to you, Ignacio, who's our Executive Director of ICVA, to kickstart the final session.
Thank you very much, Nishani, and welcome back to a great number of you. You've been really, many of you following the annual conference this year. We would have the data to provide at other moments, but there were over 1,600 registrations. As Nishani announced, we're looking at towards collective and collaborative change. And this goes through looking at working together, how the different sectors would work together to address the impact of climate and environment change on humanitarian action. But also looking at how the humanitarian sector could minimize the impact that we have ourselves on the climate and environment. So throughout the two-day conference, we've been hearing from NGOs and partners on the twofold challenges. And here I will move really very rapidly with not much of an introduction to our panelists for this session. And we will be keeping time towards the end, probably the last, I hope, to manage the last 15 to 20 minutes, at least for questions and answers, which Nishani will help me to put together to address. So really happy to open up in saying the panel composition. We have Mrs. Adelina Kamal, who is the Executive Director of the Asean Coordination Center for Humanitarian Assistance, the AHA Center. Adelina, thank you for joining. You're joining from Jakarta, a massive capital, and 50% is beneath sea level, and some of the areas are sinking at about the rate of 20 centimeters per year. So really, really good to have you with us. We also have with us Mr. Robert Mardini, Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Robert, calling from Geneva, and humanitarian and Geneva share an inseparable history. The first Geneva Convention, 1864, the birth of the Red Cross. We also have Mr. Ilkka Salmi, really pleased to have you with us, Director of the Disaster Preparedness and Prevention Directorate from the European Commission, and calling from Belgium. Of course, rain in Belgium, but you come from Finland with polar days, and sun does not set at all at some moments. We also have with us Mr. Pallawish Kumar, founder and CEO of Youth for Climate Action, also YOUNGO representative and EU Climate Pact ambassador, and coming and calling from a country that's had a number of climate change laws, including plans for relocations. Mr. Pallawish is calling from Fiji, and it's midnight. So thank you for joining us here. And then my huge pleasure to introduce you to Jane Baghurst. Jane Baghurst is from Christian Aid, and since last week is the new chair of Igva. So this is really the opportunity for for me to avoid additional emails and to be able to introduce Jane directly to the great number of interlocutors that Jane is going to have during this mandate that is a minimum of 3 years. So I would suggest to start right away with you, Pallawish. As I just said, you're an islander, you're a youth activist. How are youth impacted by climate and environment, and perhaps specifically in the type of context that you live in?
Thank you very much, Ignacio, and good afternoon, good evening to you all. Climate change is a reality that we islanders live every day. For the youth, is the fight of survival and preservation of our ecosystem. I chose to become a climate activist for this very reason, because the adverse impact of climate change will be at a completely different scale for our generation and the generation to come living in the Pacific. My goal and ambition is to work towards a better world where development is sustainable. So we live, it's without no one is left behind. I believe collective work especially from the youths in the Pacific, can bring out this better world that we envision and yearn for. Here in Fiji, we are already experiencing the effect of climate change, increased global temperature that has led to an increase in sea level rise around our islands. And many of our coastal communities have been forced to relocate from the effect of climate change. And more than 80 communities have been earmarked by the Fijian government for potential future relocation. Increase in natural disaster has been there for many years, and the biggest effect is natural disaster. And only few of many effects of climate change that our people are experiencing at this moment. At the constant rising of sea level by 7.3 mm annually, subsistence agriculture production and inhabited coastal areas are under constant threat. The warming of sea temperatures are also deteriorates the well-being of the coral reef and negatively affects the current of the fishes migrate. For a country that has a large group of people that rely on subsistence farming, or rather I could say fishing, this impacts their lifestyle and source of income. So how are youths impacted by the climate and the environment? Well, we islanders, we are going through each and every aspect of climate change that is currently happening and having lots of effects, the biggest effects. As a youth, as an islander, we have been facing this each and every day. We have been going through climate change each and every day. So as a youth, we feel that our generation is at risk, and we are unable to have these developments, have this production, and have this empowerment of youths. So I would say climate change is a reality, and we are being faced through these effects each and every day, and we are going through it.
Yeah, Pallawish, I mean, the people from the Pacific, from the islands, for decades, you've been sending the signal. You've been warning about the issues around fight for survival, around the ecosystem. You are a YOUNGO representative, but I think you also have a number of other hats as an advocate. And I have seen YOUNGO mobilise and advocate in climate and environment issues. Are you not getting a bit impatient?
Well, I'm getting a bit impatient actually when people are not listening to our advocacy.
And what do you think NGOs or others should be doing to be better supporting the views and opinions, the realities of people from the Pacific who are accumulating the different risks. Do you have a message for the NGO community, for instance, on how we can better support you?
Yes, it is too clear that our country, not just talking about my country, all the Pacific Islands and the islands, it is already being affected through climate change. And not just because of climate change, as you guys know, pandemic, COVID-19, everything has been affected. And my message is that the government actually, well, we are not moving towards politics at the moment. Like, I'm not talking about politics, but we are demanding that our government should take immediate action. For example, in Pacific Islands, because of some other developed countries' actions, we are facing the effects. We are facing their effects, that whatever they are doing, we are facing these days. So my address is, like, we need to act together and act now. We need the youths on board. Youths are the main people. They are not the leaders, but they are the elders of tomorrow. So we need the youths on board with policies. For example, let me touch on policies, as I have already mentioned. I was part of MOCOP 26. MOCOP 26 is it's an event where it took 2 weeks over to have this online conference attended by 350 youth delegates from 141 countries, held in late November 2020. And I was part of it. I was the only delegate representing Fiji Islands and also representing the whole Pacific. During the conference, a treaty with 18 policies were developed. We were so, I don't get this word, but we were so disappointed. Yes, we were so disappointed that because of COVID-19, the main leaders, our world leaders, they weren't able to have this session, have this conference. But as a youth, we showed them that nothing will stop us. Nothing is going to stop us. And we had this conference. So at the end of this conference, the treaty was presented. So what I am saying is that we need to have youths on board to create policies, to create lots of ideas, to give them ideas, and to be engaged with climate actions and other related areas actions that we need to take.
Thank you, Pallawish. I will be coming back to you, but thank you already for these different points that you have brought. And I would like to turn now to Mr. Ilkka Salmi. Very much, well, also linking the fact that Pallawish is also ambassador for the EU climate pact, but perhaps entering through the door of a humanitarian action, and reminding that when things become increasingly difficult, as Pallawish mentioned, there are issues of displacement of populations, relocations, or even forced. And I think just last month, the Icrc said that 10 million people globally have been forced to relocate due to adverse weather in the last 6 months alone. So this is 4 times higher than the number of fleeing conflict, and disaster displacement has quadrupled since the 1970s. So my question for you, Ilkka, how is the EU addressing future migration challenges in the context of climate change and natural disasters in its different facets? And a little bit in there is also for you to perhaps also address a question on how do you foresee impact of on the diversity of NGOs in terms of program and operations, the dynamics and the funding to deliver better.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ignacio. Thank you, colleagues. And indeed, first of all, allow me to thank for this opportunity to be present here today and represent, let's say, the donors' view and also that of the European Commission. And indeed, meanwhile, I say that I try to turn my video on, and here we go. So indeed, colleagues, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. And thank you, Ignacio, for raising an issue which is of huge importance and certainly a very, very timely topic, namely the displacement related to disasters and climate change. I mean, this is clearly an issue that we have already in the European Commission. We have carried out a series of consultations with many stakeholders, many of you who are here today virtually, and we have certainly taken note of your contributions and suggestions, recommendations, how to move this forward. However, I would just want to point out that we are already taking action. So firstly, we are strengthening our attention to the climate change by systematically integrating climate risk analysis in our interventions. That's the starting point. All our actions should be, and they are risk informed, using risk and impact assessments to better anticipate issues caused by climate events, and certainly and more specifically including those which are related to displacements. We also take this into account in our sectoral interventions, which also would include the climate and protection concerns and target vulnerable people based on needs irrespective of their status. That goes without saying. And as you were saying, Chair, indeed, this is also now one of the priority objectives in the humanitarian aid communication, the very recently adopted communication, namely really to mainstream climate change and disaster into humanitarian aid. And also another major topic, which is of course to strengthen the nexus approach, to build really the resilience of vulnerable communities. And this of course includes the forcibly displaced. So basically what we will build is let's say a more anticipatory approaches to bolster the resilience of those forcibly displaced in regions which are vulnerable to climate related and other hazards. And that was very interesting to hear my fellow panelists who just, again, were outlining the situation on the islands. And this is a clear, let's say, a real world example of where we stand. So we really need to factor in displacement more in the preparedness and to build the capacities of local actors, communities, and governments to a similar extent. And then again, we are also engaging multilaterally on this issue, as in 2022, so next year, the EU will assume the chairmanship of the platform on disaster displacement. And just on the different actors, as you were asking, I would just want to point out also the question of localization on this. So how to really also to support the front line and then first line responders in these issues. And what we will do is we will try to do the utmost really to enable the local and national actors to be better prepared and equipped really to help their communities when they face the risks. And also the challenges that they face. And we will do this in line with the Grand Bargain commitments. So this hopefully will include more flexibility and also predictability for the partners. And I would say the more efficiency into our operations. So all in all, a topic which is very high on the agenda, on the political agenda, and certainly on the agenda of us in the service trying to carry out the work on more operational and tactical level. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ilkka. I would like to come back on two quick questions. I mean, really important what you've said around bolstering the resilience environment, the risk-informed approaches, the capacities, the elements which are in the Grand Bargain 2.0, so localization and quality funding. But then when we look, because we're talking about the different sectors, when we zoom up a little bit and we see the European Pact on Migration and Asylum, which is to reform the EU migration and asylum system. And well, it's still a communication, but you've probably heard from large constituencies of NGOs some question marks also on, wait a second, have they missed out the European humanitarian aid communication has a central piece on climate change, and here there seems to be nothing amongst other concerns with the EU pact. So how does this work within the Commission to set these priorities? Is there not something missing there on the pact?
No, actually, I very well see where the concerns are coming from, and as I said, also when we have been doing the consultations and talking to NGOs and other partners, indeed it has been raised. It's certainly not forgotten. I mean, this is one of those topics that we do and cooperate very closely with our friends in another Directorate General, namely the DG Home, which is dealing with the asylum related and migration related issues. And we, of course, always have this, I would say, a daily exchange with them on to keep also these elements on board and compare the notes. I mean, interestingly enough, one of my colleagues, one of my heads of unit, just moved to the other side, so to say, of the table, but looking at the same direction. So she's extremely well placed also to bring with her the experience and the information that we have. So we certainly will coordinate these issues and take them on board. Again, I don't want to sound too bureaucratic, too administrative, but then again, it's two DGs working hand in hand, but of course being responsible for their own, let's say, fields of activity. That's basically where this might look like that it's not as integrated as it could have been, but rest assured that this message is certainly spread across the whole Commission.
Thank you, Ilkka, and I think it's also an opportunity to remind that our institutions, our organizations are made of human beings. And when we do move people amongst our organizations, it also brings the information and the dynamics which are needed also to be able to better function amongst departments, amongst sectors. We have that in all our large organizations, of course. But before moving on to Adeline, perhaps Ilkka, a few words around what you previously said on the attention on the impacts of climate change and around funding, including the climate funding, and what should NGOs be hearing about any changes? So not necessarily the funding for the NGOs, but the funding and a system that can react rapidly and bring the resources rapidly to where the issues are taking place.
Oh, excellent, very pertinent question. And first of all, I mean, if we look into the funding as far as the European Commission is concerned on the humanitarian aid on one hand and the civil protection activities on the other, which goes in a way goes hand in hand anyway in our activities, the funding has been increased, and so overall. We are still, at the proposal, we are still waiting for our, the final decisions to take place. But at least for the time being, the situation actually looks very promising, and there is a clear understanding that these are issues that we need to address, keeping in mind that, like, the European Green Deal is one of the top priorities for the European Commission. And this also does not concern only the member states, but also what we could do in the greening of humanitarian aid, for example. So a top priority on all levels. So that would be also reflected in the way we could finance these different strands of activity also in the future. So I have to say that personally, I'm relatively optimistic and confident that we will have enough resources to really address the priorities in this specific field.
Great, and I know from what you said before, it's also, of course, the quality of the resources, and on the quality, we're not going to dissecate all what we understand behind that. Thank you very much, Ilkka. I'll be coming back to you with the second round also to talk about the greening of the sector, if that's fine with you. And I'd like to turn to Adelina, and I know Adelina, you're in and out all these days from the Humanitarian and Emergency Logistic Innovation Expo. as we discussed when we spoke the other day. But perhaps also to give a little bit more on, for those who are not familiar with the AHA Center, the ASEAN is an intergovernmental organization, and the AHA Center facilitates the cooperation and coordination of disaster management amongst the 10 members. So for my question to you is very much on, because it really gives the impression that you may be ahead on a number of things. And I would be really interested for you to participate, to share with the audience on how you are collectively working with member states, UN, and NGOs, the private sector as well, to address the impact of climate change in the region.
Thank you, Ignacio, and good evening from Jakarta, Indonesia, one of the fastest sinking cities in the world, as you mentioned earlier. It's evening time here, so I hope that you can see me clearly. But thanks again for the kind introduction. I guess why you could see us as more advanced compared to the other regions, because there's no choice. ASEAN region, the Southeast Asian region, is one of the most disaster-prone region in the world. If not the most disaster, we are one of the most disaster-prone region in the world. So we live day by day, right, facing the impact of the climate change. And our region also has been home to the world-class disaster, the catastrophic disasters of all time. And that included the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami that affected 4 out of the 10 ASEAN countries, including my home country, Indonesia, the 2008 Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, the 2013 Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, and many other catastrophic disasters that have occurred in our part of the region. And Indonesia and Philippines are also known as the supermarket and 7-Eleven of disasters, right? We have almost all kinds of disasters in our region. We happen to be also archipelagic in nature, both Indonesia and the Philippines. Basically, in our region, if you get one, if you have one disaster, you get 1 or 2 for free. It's like it's the perennial nature of the disasters in our region, and that also because of the climate change. But it's not something that that we should be proud of. Being the 7-Eleven and supermarket of disaster, we need to change that headline from being the 7-Eleven supermarket of disasters into a region that is disaster resilient, into a region that is capable of reducing the risk and also the impact of disaster. So that is actually one of the biggest challenges in ASEAN, and we know that the climate change will just only increase the severity, complexity, and frequency of disaster in our region. AHA Center has been established for more than 10 years. So we were established in November 2011. And in the past 9 to 10 years since our establishment, we have been monitoring the disasters in our region. And it's quite interesting, Ignacio, that over the past 9 to 10 years, we observed that 90% of annual disasters in the ASEAN region actually are hydrometeorological disasters. Things like floods, droughts, right? Tropical storm. And this actually the disasters that can be anticipated. And many of these are actually made worse by the climate change. So we know that people are aware of what Greta has said, and also the environment climate change experts have said. But I think when it comes to a real action, right, addressing climate change, I think we need to first understand the human behaviors and what drives them. And only by doing that we will get into actions, right? Because people will get into actions if there are things that disrupt their livelihoods, and that includes social interaction, their comfort, And then security, that includes food and water, because hungry people are angry people. And third, economy, and that means money. So we need to have solid evidence, facts and figures that will show, unless urgent actions are taken, their livelihoods, their security, and their economy, money included, will be drastically disrupted. Because what we are talking here is a reset in the mind and approach. So that's our strategy. AHA Center last year published a report. It's actually our annual publication. We call it ASEAN Risk Monitor and Disaster Management Review. And we intentionally decided to select the topic of climate crisis. Why? Because we want to show to our member states, our partners, our communities, that it is time to act. And even the title is very impatient. It says that time is running out, why ASEAN must act now against climate emergency. That's the title of our publication. We realize that there's so many talk at the global level, but we need to scale down this assessment and the studies into regional level, and really asking the question, what 1.5 degrees Celsius increase mean to ASEAN region? So we gather 25 authors, including researchers and scientists, to actually write articles to answer this question. And that includes, providing statistics and evidence, because again, we should start with a change in the mindset first, and a change in the mindset can only be done if we present them with facts and figures. After we change the mindset through the knowledge, right? Then their behavior will change. Then it will lead to action. Then we will have a systematic change. Then we can institutionalize the change, right? So that's what we have been doing. Advocate change through evidence, not opinion, because opinion is the lowest form of knowledge. Then by doing that, people, are more convinced. Then the analysis gathered from our expert, and it's not only governments, not only AHA Center writing that articles, 25 authors, academic institution, UN, the Red Cross, some other partners were involved in the making of our publication about the climate crisis. And we gather them through webinar knowledge. We also invited our member states to write some of the articles. And then we had a debate basically on what it means. And then that actually served as one of the bases to shape the next work program and the work plan of ASEAN in disaster management and emergency response. If you see the work program that was just published last November, a lot of things actually relate to why anticipatory actions are needed. A lot of things actually relate to a more evidence-based, right? Risk analysis, looking at the multiple risks, and also the different kinds of risks that are now actually happening, not only because of the climate change, but also other risks that we tend to overlook, and we tend to kind of like look at with this angle, and then also really involve the other sectors into the discussion. So I guess start with evidence first, that will change the mindset, and then later our behavior, our attitude, and our action will change. So that's how we do it. Yeah.
That's great, Adelina, and the ADMIR, the Asian agreement on disaster management and emergency response is of course the work program that you were referring to, and the element, of course, on gathering the evidence. The analysis of risks. With this approach, are you also managing to get on board in a substantial way the private sector? Are you managing to trigger anticipatory financing for humanitarian or for disaster management?
Okay. Yes, the answer is yes. So if we look at, well, there are two things that I would like to show you. One is the collaborative nature of our work program under the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response. You will see that ASEAN community, including the ASEAN Center, is calling for participation of not only the governments, but also our partners, including the civil society, including the academic and technical institution and research institution, including the private sector. And there are actually elements about this forecast-based financing and looking into disaster risk financing insurance and so on and so forth. The way I see it, when we talk about anticipatory action, it's not only about forecast-based financing. Yeah, we also need to look into the trigger actions. We need to, one of the things that are now being championed under our work program, also by the AHA Center, is the need for this region, for ASEAN region, to shift our mindset from a crisis management approach into a more risk management approach. Mm-hmm. So we don't wait until the disaster get big, right? Because again, 90% of our annual disaster can be anticipated. So what actually are the things? So is okay. Financing is one, right? But there are also, other preparedness measures that can be done at the local, national, and regional level. We can learn from the Philippines. Indonesia can learn from the Philippines. We just got hit by tropical storm Seroja, one of the eastern provinces of Indonesia. And normally, Indonesia just got hit by the tail, not the eye. But, we could learn from the Philippines. They got hit 20 times in a year. And even last year, they got hit by 9 storms within the period of 3 months, right? And it's actually a very strong typhoon. So we can facilitate this learning on how Philippines, for example, has done the preemptive evacuation, and then how they can make sure that there are 0 casualties, and how they prepare themselves before the tropical cyclone or the storm hit the Philippines. And Indonesia can learn from the Philippines can learn from Indonesia, other countries can learn from Indonesia. So these are also some of the things that we're trying to facilitate under the work program. Exchange learning, because every country has our own way of doing things, but we can always learn from them, learn on the trigger action, learn on the things that can be done not only in terms of financing, but also preparing community actions and so on and so forth. And that is actually the role of a regional organization like AHA Center. It's not only for one ASEAN, one response, not only for action, but also facilitating preparedness, and also changing the mindset, including the knowledge exchange, including the science-based, evidence-based decision-making.
Thank you very much, Adelina. Certainly from the perspective of Igva, that we've had the pleasure of being consulted and working on the ADMER, certainly appreciation for the involvement that you have called for NGOs. And certainly, I think what you have also said, and the experience certainly that we've had, also demonstrate how important it is to have that focus on the regional levels, and how you go also further in a number of topics that we speak about at global level. I would like to move on. I would certainly come back to you, Adelina, and probably on that question around the understanding of localization, and I'll get back to that in a moment. I would like to turn to you now, Robert. Thank you for your patience. And it's looking at the Icrc, as many of the actors in the humanitarian field, we are overstretched, underfunded. And my question to you is, why is climate change important? And even you also said it's close to your heart, so beyond the organization as well. Why is it so important to an organization like Icrc? And how will it further impact humanitarian action? And perhaps with some comments, perhaps inputs on the conflict contexts, and how does climate change exacerbate or the conflict situations?
Thank you very much, Ignacio. And actually, it's close to my heart because I started as a humanitarian worker, as an engineer, working on water projects, and I could see firsthand the combination of the consequences of environmental degradation, climate change, and also armed conflict. And so now, why is it so important for the ICRC? The short answer is really that climate change is increasingly important for ICRC because people suffering from armed conflict are on the front line of the climate crisis as well. Thousands of my colleagues today in the field are witnessing day in and day out the double impacts of climate shocks and conflicts. And these shocks are costing lives. People are exposed to disease, malnutrition, and displacement. Today, out of the 20 countries considered the most vulnerable to climate change and least ready to adapt, 12, so 60%, are actually in conflict, in places that have been damaged by decades of conflict and fragility. People's coping mechanisms are radically eroded by violence and instability. This makes them extremely vulnerable to any shocks, including those resulting from climate change. And this means, in concrete terms, that if you want to respond adequately to people's needs and help them be resilient, we need to factor in climate and environmental risks in a genuine way. Otherwise, our responses will be ill-adapted and I would say also irrelevant. It is particularly critical to rebalance efforts and invest more in preventive and long-term resilience strengthening efforts than just dealing with the crisis. And at ICRC today, we have long considered the environment through a pure international humanitarian law, so IHL prism, but we had not until very recently focused on the humanitarian consequences of climate risks. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, the plain reality, the very fact that these impacts are blatant in some of the places where we work, really forced us to focus on these risks. And you also alluded, Ignacio, in your question on the relationship or the correlation between climate change and armed conflict. And here, I'll be very clear, and I think this is a good news. Climate change does not directly cause conflict, at least not today. So places such as Australia or Japan are extremely exposed to climate risks, and yet they are peaceful. Having said that, and our field practice really bears witness to the fact that in the absence of institutions able to mediate tensions and manage resources equitably, climate risks and environmental degradation may further fuel local tensions and instability and contribute to shaping dynamics of violence. This is the case in many countries where we work, for instance, in southern Iraq, in northern Mali, or in South Sudan, where I visited recently. People commonly speak of tensions around access to depleted or depleting resources, changes to transhumance patterns across the Sahel and beyond have also led to changes in dynamics of violence and exacerbated existing violence and conflict.
Yeah, so then these protection implications, how to manage them, and perhaps with that answer also perhaps relating also to the joined up collaboration that we have said we need. So from a humanitarian development nexus, we are now looking across humanitarian development, peace, and climate. How is ICRC engaging into these discussions on operational level, but also on the advocacy level?
Okay, so first, maybe the first part of your question about the protection implications, maybe. So at ICRC, we see that the growing climate risk and environmental degradation are really affecting all dimensions of people's lives, from their safety and health to their food, water, and economic security. So if you zoom in on the work we do to strengthen people's protection, let me first stress, Ignacio, that we are still developing our analysis and approaches. And therefore, here, a word of cautious and modesty, we are still at a learning stage. So we need to develop a fuller understanding of how, in conflict-affected countries, the transformation of the environment and competition for scarce resources can fuel intercommunal tensions and violence and shape dynamics of violence. We also need to further unpack the intersection between climate risks, conflict, and displacement. Mm-hmm. We also need to define the role that we can play in alleviating the suffering that this can create and in changing the patterns of behavior that cause this suffering in the first place. For instance, we may contribute to easing tensions through community-based mediation or by helping communities and authorities shape transhuman routes to reduce the risks of intercommunal violence through, for instance, locations where we can or other organizations can provide immunization services or a water point for livestock. Second, given the centrality of conflict and IHL to our work and the fuller examination of the consequences of armed conflict for the environment, we should complement our analysis of the protection of the natural environment under IHL and inform our dialogue with parties to the conflict. This is a very important part also of what we do. So whether or not they are caused by the conduct of hostilities, the consequences of environmental damage can devastate conflict-affected communities for decades. If you take Iraq, for instance, the cutting of date palms in the 80s during the Iraq-Iran war and the massive weapon contamination continue to significantly affect people's lives until today. And as always, analysis and responses must be context-specific. So consider the cross-border implication of a changing climate and environment, for instance, on human mobility. It must also take into account how particular risks are influenced by individual characteristics such as their age and manifest themselves differently in urban, peri-urban and rural areas. And this analysis also needs to feed into a discussion on how to ensure that our programs do not inadvertently deter people from adapting in the longer term. For instance, assisting people may contribute to helping them stay longer in environments that are becoming simply increasingly inhospitable or uninhabitable because of the climate change. So here there is this do no harm notion that is very important. And in such circumstances, assistance needs at least to be complemented with up-to-date information on climate trends and adaptation pathways so people can take informed decisions to leave or to stay. You had another question on how would the ICRC advocate for more joined up and collaborative action among member states, donor, multilateral organization, also on the need to work across the humanitarian development, peace, climate nexus. And maybe here, in an ideal world, I would say that the combined efforts of humanitarian development and peace actors in any given location would really result in a comprehensive response that meets the immediate and long-term needs and strengthen resilience through individualized systemic and structural measures, which also, while also addressing long-term instability and fragility. So in practice, the limited tolerance for risk of development actors often prevents them from fully engaging in areas affected by conflict, especially when these areas are not under the control of that country's government. I mean, today, bear in mind that according to ICRC, 65 to 70 million people live in areas controlled by non-state armed groups. This gaps has led organizations like the ICRC to engage in longer-term programming to strengthen resilience, notably through livelihood support and water and sanitation activities. But there are limits to our ability to compensate for the comprehensive development that provides solid avenues for climate adaptation. There are places where we work where instability and fragility have long deterred inclusive development efforts, and in such settings, the activities necessary to facilitate people's adaptation are often beyond the scope of our capacities. And we need also to find ways to collectively, as a sector, to ensure that steps are taken to help reduce people's vulnerability, even in highly challenging environments. Otherwise, people will be felt with no option but to move. We must continue to encourage those who can work at the required scale to find ways to do so, and when appropriate, forge partnerships to advance efforts with them. Strengthening responses in challenging environments is also key if states are to live up to the SDGs. And this is why the Climate and Environment Charter includes a commitment to work collaboratively across the humanitarian sector and beyond to strengthen climate and environmental action, and a commitment to use our influence to mobilize urgent and more ambitious climate action and environmental protection. And one final point, maybe strengthening responses also requires addressing critical gaps in climate finance. It was mentioned by my fellow panelist earlier. And for now, despite the clear vulnerability of conflict-affected communities, they are totally neglected by climate finance. Over to you, Ignacio.
Yeah, and I really hope we'll be able to go, and that is also one of the issues around localization that I hope we'll be able to touch a little bit, but certainly really loud and clear, Robert, on the importance of working together, but also recognizing the limitations that focus on the highly vulnerable areas. That is also where very few are managing to go. I'd like to now move on to, with really great pleasure, to Jane. Tell us, is Igva still a humanitarian network, or after the General Assembly that took place last week?
ICVA is very much still a humanitarian network, and that's to your first question. But I think we're adapting and we're changing. The ICVA 2030 9-year strategy adopted by last week's General Assembly presents 5 transformations, of which one is a focus on addressing the impact of climate change on humanitarian action. The ICVA General Assembly also adopted commitments and motion to action on environment, climate, humanitarian action. The 2030 strategy really sets all of the network and the Secretariat in a direction, as I've just said. The motion to action commits the membership to do 5 things. It commits them to be guided by the leadership and experience, be part of the solution, reduce the impacts through our own action, mobilise and advocate others to narrow the gap and strengthen collaboration. That said, ICVA has now, since I think yesterday, correct me, Ignacio, signed up to the Climate and Environment Charter of Humanitarian Organisations, and ICVA members will consider signing the charter individually. We'll be looking also at collective ways with partners to support our members to be able to live up to the commitments shared in the charter, including ahead of COP23. This built on a series of in-depth consultations last year, and I think it's worthwhile noting that we as a board wondered what added value there would be as ICVA to the fantastic work being done by many of our stakeholders and partners, as has been highlighted over the past 2 days. However, during the ICVA 2030 consultations last year, 84% of participants stated that environmental change and its impact on creating and alleviating humanitarian needs should be a core focus for ICVA. Nearly 70% of participants stated that their organisation already had a dedicated strategy or approach for integrating environmental change issues into their humanitarian action. And these figures can be compared with the 2017 survey informing the ICVA's 2019 to 2021 strategy, where mentions of environmental sustainability of humanitarian action and related issues were almost absent. So ICVA will be engaging on addressing impacts of the climate change on humanitarian action, also through our focus areas of forced migration, humanitarian coordination, and humanitarian financing, working in collaboration and drawing on the wealth of knowledge, as I've mentioned just now, and experience of ICVA members and many of our partner networks.
Thank you, Jane. And from what happened last week in the Igva General Assembly, really to dive into where you have worked for so many years also, which is much closer to the issues. And I had a question for you around food insecurity and climate change, also because we're ahead of a number of major advocacy opportunities, let alone the G7 in just a few weeks, where issues around food insecurity are on the agenda, and we do see the structural vulnerabilities of the food systems, the local and the global food systems, and they are hit in different contexts much harder, and with some of them enduring really major impacts from climate change, making food more scarce. So all this really calls for very rapid, massive, important decisions, which are not only around funding. What is being done to mobilize different actors to be able to call for those who may have the power to respond to some at least short-term or medium-term, to be able to react at the risk of finding ourselves in dealing with massive situations of food insecurity?
Firstly, I think it's worthwhile just stepping back for a moment to kind of setting the scene, because often we have colleagues in the ICVA network that do amazing work on famine prevention, on food insecurity, on nutrition, others that work on climate mitigation, calls around that, adaptation, climate financing, including anticipatory forecast-based financing, for example. But often I think we work in, I don't think they're solos, but we're very good. We have very fantastic experts, and we don't necessarily speak to each other across the network. I think that the nexus work that I might come on to later, I think has challenged us to do so. But also when we think about our response to climate risk and environmental damage and risks around that, I think it also challenges to think around our work across expertise. And just stepping back for a moment, Christian Aid's Counting the Cost 2020, a year of climate breakdown, identified 15 of the most destructive climate disasters of the year, costing between $1.5 and $5 billion, but also with high non-financial losses. And you're right, what we're seeing within Christian Aid South Sudan, we are seeing the convergence of shocks, escalating famine across those areas of expertise, as I was trying to explain earlier. We are witnessing the building evidence that the rain pattern is shifting and changing at the equatorial belt. And when they come, they are more severe and destructive in nature. The impact is the flooding we are seeing today, for example, in Jonglei, Upper Nile, where thousands of people have been living in water. Whereas flooding was ad hoc before, we're now seeing that this is becoming generalized. In 2020, state officials said that these have been the most intense rainfalls in the last decades, worse than other historical floods, such as those from 1946 and 1988. The water level of the Blue Nile River rose to over 17 meters in September, setting a new record. But also areas outside of the flooding continue to be affected by a conflict, which inhibits people to move freely to safer areas to access food. So in effect, what we're seeing is the compounding effects of COVID-19, flooding caused by climate change, and intercommunal fighting, sustaining their vulnerability. Floods, conflict, and COVID-19 have entwined to deliver devastation and fuel the food crisis. The combined result is the destruction of crops, livelihoods, houses and dwellings. Roads have become impassable, markets have stopped, supply chains have been crippled, and food prices have absolutely soared. So in advance of COP26, with many others, we are calling for increased financial support to the world's poorest countries and a push for their debts to be cancelled. We have to see that alongside of an investment in a green recovery that leaves no one behind, and increase in investment in both adaptation and where this has been inadequate, loss and damage. We also need to see we need to stop the expansion of fossil fuel energy and support clean energy to scale up mitigation. This isn't something that's outside of the humanitarian sector. We've seen over the past 2 days, all our partners, all our stakeholders are saying the same thing. We're seeing the same effects. And so I think we need to be looking at some of the causal issues in an objective way as humanitarians. We don't need to get into the politics, but we do need to, I think, look at those 3 areas that, for example, Christian Aid's looking for in order to address the compounding effects of different drivers. And what can we do as ICVA? Well, Mark Lowcock, our emergency relief coordinator, said recently that we need to reach a place where data-driven, automatic and anticipatory response more often becomes our default activity. That will help us deliver the most effective, cost-efficient humanitarian response possible, he said. So we do need to accelerate our anticipatory approaches. But we also need to invest in the capacity of humanitarian actors alongside that, notably local actors. We need to invest in setting up the right plans and modalities, using, sharing our tools to implement anticipatory action, early action, and invest in disaster preparedness. We need to set up mechanisms for coordinated, predictable, flexible financing, as many people have said over the last 2 days. And we also need to establish close collaboration with national disaster management authorities, something that we're very good at doing, for example, through our NGO fora, including ICVA's regional fora, and that we know as well our colleagues in the Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies are very good at doing with the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Action Centre and through their auxiliary role.
Right, thanks, Jane. We have a lot after 1 hour of exchange. I've just managed to do 1 round to all of you, but with many really interesting points that you 5 panelists have brought. I would suggest to move on to the questions that have been sent in the chat box. I think there's at least 1 question for each, and then I hope we would then have a little bit of time for the remaining topics that I wanted to touch on with you. There is a question from Andrew Guevan Gim for Pallawish. And you probably saw it in the chat. I get them sent on my phone because there's quite a lot going on the chat there. Andrew says, "Thank you, Pallawish, for your presentation." And the question is, what practical steps are the youth taking in fighting climate change apart from policy development?
Thank you very much, moderator. The youths can help stop climate change, as I have already mentioned in the chat, in their own simple way, yet a purposeful way, such as joining environmental organizations or groups, participating in various governmental, non-governmental schools, and like all the programs, activities, projects against climate change, joining cleanup drives in schools. To be more exact about green drives, it's youths and its green space, which my organization, Youth for Climate Action Project, has came up with a campaign that we are driving towards green and cleaner environment. So we have a campaign name known as Youth and its Green Space. So that is one thing what we youths are doing, getting involved with Go Green activities. And also, not just in terms of policies, we are also lobbying government to have youth development. For example, we have suggested a youth parliament a normal youth parliament where youth can make decisions. It comes under policy development, yet we want to have youth empowerment, youth development, and also having campaigns such as zero-use plastics. Since 2020, Fiji has banned its plastic, and in from 2021, 1st January, we have banned our plastic forms. So these are some of the activities that we can get into rather than talking about policy development.
Thank you, Pallawish. And if I may, I really feel that over the years, and perhaps with an acceleration the last years, youth have played such an important role for the awareness and the impatience that we should have in really pushing to reboot, to rethink, and you certainly that was also linked to my first question. How can we better offer the avenues for you to be able to play your key role? There's Ilkka, there's a question for you around root causes. It says, thank you for your presentation. Refugee and migration problems are mainly due to poverty, poor infrastructure, poor governance, etc., in the country of origin. And the question is, why can't the EU do something about addressing these issues in the countries concerned? EU leaders seem to look the other and are only concerned about protecting their borders. The root causes of refugees and migration and conflicts and so on, they are not addressed. Even they contribute too much to humanitarian problems and climate change. So that I would say, I guess that goes for you certainly, Ilkka. I don't know if you want to comment a little bit.
Thank you. I certainly will, even if it's slightly. Let me allow that I kind of slightly disagree with the starting point that the EU wouldn't be actively looking into the root causes as well. I think that's not the issue as such. Of course, on the humanitarian aid side, this is mainly we certainly look into the preparedness and prevention in a way, and also to the response. But on a more long-term, more, let's say, fundamental issues, the colleagues in our international department, international partnership Directorate General, the DG INTPA, are actually certainly looking into these issues, how to improve the conditions in those countries of origin where we do see issues with migration and all that. So categorically saying that we wouldn't address the root causes, I would not agree with that assumption. Unfortunately, I'm not now in a position to come up with the exact facts or figures, how much support, what sort of programs do we have in place. But nevertheless, this is certainly a fundamental part of the EU's activities as well. And unfortunately, of course, we have not managed to solve these issues, but at least hopefully to deliver some relief by addressing the root causes as well. Yeah. Thank you.
And certainly the root causes is where our collective work between sectors is absolutely needed. There's another question for you, Ilkka, if I may. It refers to the Somalia Humanitarian Fund, but perhaps it's to bring it at the question of, I'm changing a little bit the question, but it's around due diligence and perhaps a certain concern that with the plan of greening the way we work, the sector, to use the word greening, we're going to be getting additional due diligence systems, and of which the smaller organizations perhaps are not going to be able to follow, to respond to. Is the EU going to be supporting the sector, or part of the sector, the NGOs, some of the NGOs perhaps, reaching the requirements the targets that we would like to set to green the sector?
Thank you. A very, very good and pertinent question. Actually, of course, indeed, while we are also setting the bar higher, indeed, as you rightly pointed out, Ignacio, we are certainly there also to support the actors. I mean, it's not only that we let's say tighten our requirements without really providing some sort of an assistance and support. And there are some very concrete issues that are already going on and that we have already now planned for the 2021 and also for next year to come. We will certainly provide online training modules. We will provide virtual classrooms to our partners. And then again, it's not only about really teaching or preaching about these issues, because the dialogues that I have had with many actors on the ground, I have also noticed that many of them have actually already a well advanced plans how to be greener in a future, and that's of course a great starting point. So it's more, I would call it more dialogue with our partners than really an educating anyone on these issues. But certainly we also want to have an opportunity to pilot some of the innovative solutions and also funding some of the study and assessment projects. So we are there to support. And of course, at the same time, we will also look into our own actions, how we could do that, and perhaps also provide, let's say, at some stage, also a compendium of the best practices and also the let's say, support tools in this respect. So indeed, while the requirements are let's say, set on a higher level, the support will be there, and I invite all the colleagues interested in this sort of trainings to get in touch with us, and we could then see how we could, how could we provide, let's say, more detailed assistance if need be.
That's great. Thank you, Ilkka. I do feel that probably this conversation, also with the focus that you have on localization, and also the way we have to change our ways of working, certainly to respond to do no harm and the greening of the way we work. Certainly, that's going to be a key element of the conversation on how to support the smaller organizations to be able to respond to the requirements. To Adelina, we have a set of questions, but I will go to the one that refers to innovations, because also, as you have this week, the HaHa Center is organizing I understand, virtual innovation several days, and it's very much asking what are the innovations that you are seeing within your region, and perhaps specifically from the helix that the HaHa Center has been organizing, and what comes to your mind in terms of innovations from the region that you would like to share with the audience?
Well, thank you very much for that question. We just concluded actually our helix is the Humanitarian Emergency and Logistic Innovation Expo. So it has actually it's one of the biggest online event that HaHa Center has organized so far. It's supposed to be done on site in Hanoi. We are co-organizing it with the Vietnam Disaster Management Authorities. Was supposed to be done last year, but because of the COVID-19 that we had, we have to change into the online platform. We have actually 1,000 people registered for our event. And our event also include 21 focus sessions. Some of them talk about green logistics, by the way, and a lot actually talking about how to answer the problems that we have in this region when it comes to humanitarian logistics, and whether there are any solutions out there, both from this region as well as outside the region, that could be used to answer the humanitarian logistic problems in ASEAN. So it's very much anchored on problems, Ignacio, because as you know, the mother of all invention is the problem, right? Is necessity. So we cannot just sell products or propose solution without actually knowing what the problems are. And when it comes to Southeast Asian region, we have all the problems in the world, right? Because after all, we're one of the most disaster-prone region in the world. So it's actually a perfect, ASEAN region is a perfect innovation lab for humanitarian logistic problems. And that's where we started. We gathered our ASEAN countries and also practitioners, as well as partners, and asked these pertinent questions on what actually often encountered as problems when it comes to humanitarian logistics. And we also had our own analysis, the AHA Center, in terms of facilitating ASEAN collective response in the region, what actually are the common problems that ASEAN countries have. So it's very much, I think, the interesting part, and this is where I could see from the today that there are many locally adapted solutions, and really coming from experiencing the disasters, yourself. Then you came up, this the winner of the iPitch competition. We have this competition where participants will pitch their ideas in front of judges and audience live. Right, the winner actually is coming from the Philippines, and then we also have a winner on the other category from Indonesia, and they become the winners. Why? Because they actually came up and customized the solution based on actual disasters that they experienced, being a disaster survivors themselves. So it's problem-driven, needs-based solution. And the beauty of it doesn't have to be this high-tech technology. We talk about locally adapted solutions coming from the region, actually produced by the disaster survivors and the communities themselves, that we can actually scale up and replicate it to other countries in the ASEAN region. And a lot of it actually related to green logistic, how actually we shift our mindset, right? From providing items to disaster-affected population based on what we have as an organization to based on what the communities need. And for that requires a change in the mindset, because then we have to take into account the future. We have to utilize the technology, right, to cut layers to make sure that people will get the most out of what we can offer. So that's what just happened. Thank you very much
Adelina,
for that.
Thank you. Do I understand correctly then that because there are lots of private companies also coming to Helix for, you mentioned items related to logistics, humanitarian logistics. Do I understand correctly that the central part of this is the innovations also to minimize the impact on the environment and the challenges that we encounter as humanitarians to have, and the different elements there, and not only the carbon imprints, but many others. Do I understand correctly?
Yes, that's correct. So it's a melting pot. We provide the Helix as a platform for convergence of minds and ideas and solution, and it's unlike any other expo where companies will sell their products. We have an online virtual exhibition as well, but rather we also encourage those who have not developed their ideas into prototype or into scale up to also pitch their ideas. So it doesn't have to be at the product level. So that's one. We encourage ideas as well. And then second, it's not only companies, academic institutions, students. We have youth sessions from the Philippines. They're actually showing their tuk-tuk, the electric car to transport, women in the urban areas. And then there's so many other innovative solutions at the local level. And so these are actually coming not only from the companies that we have in the region and outside the region, but also from the communities, from the NGOs, local NGOs, from the academic institution. One of the winners from Singapore actually is from NUS, National University of Singapore, and they came up with this brilliant idea of board, game of a game. It's the board game that then converted into online game to help the disaster managers, practice their planning in humanitarian logistics. So it's a lot of things. it also talk about the concept of green logistic, how actually we put it into actions, how to help actually the countries, right? Many. But what is actually quite interesting is that because of the COVID-19, and you mentioned about localization, there's no way. The only way and the highway is actually to turn it into more localized approach, because disaster is local. And when it comes to humanitarian logistic, they are actually good providers within the region and within the countries. And it doesn't have to be high tech. It doesn't have to. When we talk about innovation, it's not only products, Ignacio. That's what I also stressed during the Helix conference. It's also about changing the processes, the business models, and the behavior. And therefore, ideas were also welcome during the conference.
Thank you very much, Adelina. But I would just mention that within Igva, we have a few large humanitarian organizations from China, from Indonesia, and they do really bring and push us in different ways of thinking on different business models. And you've mentioned a few really key elements and I really thank you for that. I know we're running. Well, we have 7 minutes left. There are still a number of questions, and I would like to turn one really rapidly to you, Robert. And it's a little bit of continuation of the discussion with Adelina around our responsibility to do no harm, but also to green the work we are doing. And though during the conference we have touched on the charter, we had Jagan this morning who mentioned it and so on. I wanted to hear also from you, from the charter as a collective action that IFRC, ICRC have been really in the driving seat.
No, thank you very much, Ignacio. I think let me first start by saying that in this charter there is an implicit hierarchy in the commitments that we took, and that we hope many NGOs will be following us and signing up to this charter, because I think it's a real collective effort. And this first commitment is really about first and foremost stepping up our response to growing humanitarian needs and help people adapt to the impacts of the climate and environmental crisis. So this really speaks to our role as humanitarian organization to protect and assist, which means really to have this climate lens in anything we do. And I would say not only in a do no harm mindset, but even to reduce sometimes the tensions. The example I mentioned earlier, when we can also influence head of tribes or armed groups to change the transhumance routes, this can really alleviate some of the tensions and also contribute to save lives, in addition to, of course, vaccinating the livestock. The next commitment is really to maximize the environmental sustainability of our work and rapidly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which should not be read as potentially limiting our capacity to respond, but we make it clear that in line with the principle of do no harm, we will limit the damage we cause to the environment and the climate while maintaining our ability to provide timely and principled humanitarian assistance and programs. And the greenest way to operate would be not to operate at all. So this is not an option, of course, but we can limit our impact on the environment and the climate by optimizing our use of energy and resources and the way we manage waste, for instance, let alone, of course, the supply chain that is responsible of a great deal of gas emissions if you take at the scale of the entire humanitarian sector. We are also committed to working on both fronts. When we adopted the charter, we committed to factoring climate and environmental risk in our programs at ICRC, all our programs at ICRC by 2025. We also committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2030 compared to 2018 levels. And I really encourage us all within the sector to take such commitment and to stick to them. In terms of support, we are both looking at amending and sharing our existing tools with the sectors. For instance, we have developed at ICRC a carbon accounting tool for ICRC and are now working with a consultant and several humanitarian organizations to see if we can adapt it so it can be also used by other organizations within the sector. We are also sharing knowledge and practices and are hosting a sustainable supply chain alliance that will hopefully yield results for the sectors as a whole. So this is a contribution, but I think the key word and the best way to promote this charter is through implementation and through really walking the talk on the ground where it matters, where people are really caught between a rock and a hard place. Over to you, Ignacio.
Thank you, Robert. The implementation, of course, but there is a call for us to be collectively committing behind these points, and you can find already in a number of places since I think it's beginning of this week the possibility to sign on the charter. And as you said, there's all the collective work also behind of putting existing tools together, because quite a lot of work has been done before. It's just that it has to be scaled up and accessible for many, many more. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to start really turning closing, and I would like, there are a number of questions that are out there that we haven't been able to address. There's just one in a moment that I'm going to come back to, but before that, Jane, if you had a short call to action, what would it be? Oops, I think you're muted, Jane.
Hi. I think it would be three things. I think it would be financing an ecosystem that can move funds quickly where it's needed most. It's better connecting with multiple sectors, and it's taking forward the work that we did as the ICVA network last year on risk sharing. So that means understanding who is actually shouldering that risk, ensuring that those that are doing most of the risk shouldering are actually identifying those risks and are setting in place and framing the supportive systems that are necessary. But I also think that we, in line with that, we need to think about a couple of things. And I would say we need to address three main challenges. We need to look at government donor funding for climate finance alongside savvy concurrent crisis financing for anticipatory and early action and funding for climate adaptation. We need to finance an ecosystem, as I mentioned just now, that moves funds quickly where it is needed most. We have not yet addressed the targets set by the 2016 high-level panel on humanitarian financing, which also include not only efficiency, but reducing need and diversifying funding. We need to look at quality of partnerships. As I alluded to just now, local and national actors must be at the centre of that. So that includes donors and international NGOs cascading overheads to frontline local and national NGOs and community groups to support institutional strengthening, risk sharing, harmonised and simplified due diligence. Thirdly, we need a green COVID-19 recovery that leaves no one behind. As I mentioned earlier, we need to have an increase in investment in both adaptation and where this has been inadequate loss and damage. And we need to call for debt cancellation and a halt to fossil fuels alongside expert organisations that have been doing that for years. That three-pronged framework must have two critical drivers: putting people most affected by crisis in the driving seat of the response, using, for example, our existing accountability to affected populations and core humanitarian standard, and investment in local and national actors, meaningful leadership across all the core decisions at every level. ICVA's added value is going to be across that, but it's also around bringing together small, medium and large NGOs in the network to analyse and learn from each other in order to adapt and adjust responses to ensure we don't exacerbate climate change risks and prevent and mitigate further harm to the environment. And we really need to improve our collective action across networks, improve our connectivity across multiple actors. As we've seen over the past 2 days, hopefully we can take this forward. Thanks, Ignacio.
Thank you, Jane. And before going to a few closing words for this annual conference, I want to come back to people most affected. And there is a question that unfortunately we don't have time to answer, but it does remind, and I hope it will make us all reflect. There's a question from Northeast region of India, from an activist, Tukang Chongsin Koing Reng. Sorry for the bad pronunciation. Indigenous woman and Indigenous person with disabilities rights. Now, the question is, how can the issues of Indigenous women and Indigenous women with disabilities could be addressed in respect of climate change and its impact? In what manner could they be actively involved and make aware for active participation, and in brackets, and policies? I think important to, even if with apologies, we won't attempt to respond to that question, just to finish with keeping in mind of where are the people that are most vulnerable. And certainly that is where our support is strongly needed as humanitarians, and exacerbated, of course, with the climate issues. So we are at the closing of the second online annual conference. I really want to thank the 5 panelists that we have had. I know we've run through a great number of issues and not been able to take all the different questions that were there. But thank you very much, Adelina, Jane, Robert, Ilkka, and Pallawish. Many thanks to you. Overall, on the annual conference, I wish to thank the participants, Igva members, other NGOs, NGO fora, states, donors, UN agencies, experts, and other climate and environment sector stakeholders. Great appreciation for the 36 speakers, panelists and moderators, for the way they brought their insights, stimulated conversation. And certainly this will be guiding, at least for Igva, the work with our members. PHAP, Marcus, and the great team, including the interpreters, the sign interpreters, and the captioner. You have, as a team, PHAP, you have once again been a first-class partner in ensuring the conversations are as accessible as possible for the diversity of the audience. This annual conference is, of course, only part of the needed conversations geared to urgent collective action. The annual conference this year has been shaped with hours of exchange with a number of you, and you're really thanked, as well as from 500 survey respondents from 89 countries. And the final thanks to the Igva team, led by Nishani, who have put this together, run the Igva annual conference while juggling with 101 other things. The Igva team will be following up with an annual conference outcome document, a learning stream, and promotion of tools. To have positive expectations about the future, hope has to be driven by our capacity to identify goals and set strategies to achieve them. And this capacity lies outside existing silos and requests for humanitarian, development, and climate communities to efficiently work together to shape policy, increase resilience, improve practice. The annual conference is about rolling up our sleeves within our work environment. It goes with expectations and hope that we will change individually for this needed transformation. Keep safe, and thank you for following.